Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring contribution and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. All right, it was a kind of uneventful week behind me, another relatively uneventful one ahead, except that we're taking my old man into the hospital tomorrow for a heart valve procedure. They expect it'll just be an overnight stay, relatively routine, which would be better than his 4-month yo-yo of hospital and rehab clinic stays last year. Keep your fingers crossed. You'll find out next week how it went. On the running side, I ran another 5K race this weekend and set a new personal record. Honestly, I was just trying to keep pace with one of the older guys from my running group. By older, I mean 21 years older than me. And then, kick it in for the last quarter mile and try to pass some people ahead of me and beat Fran, my pal. The thing was, when we finished, Fran told me that he was just trying to keep pace with me the whole time. So we somehow backed into mutually assured destruction doctrine, which was kind of neat, although it worked out pretty well for me. I set a new record, like I said. He also did far better than he was expecting. The thing is, I have only run 4 5Ks so far, and I've managed to shave an average of 40 seconds off my time with each one, which means in another dozen or so, I'll actually be traveling faster than a car. Considering I was dealing with a head cold on this one as well as a kind of sore hip, I'm pretty happy about a 44-second improvement from last month. So that's the running thing. In reading news, I started reading The Sheltering Sky during a not sleeping well night this weekend, and I'm enjoying that one quite a bit. It was always, sort of peripherally on my radar. I just had never read it, and it came up in Frederick Tutton's Memoirs and during our podcast, and that led me to finally buy a copy. And then one night when I couldn't sleep, hanging out downstairs in my library, I thought rather than just read Twitter until I drift off in a rage, I'll take this book off the shelf and find out what it's about. Also, I now finally know, 36 years after the fact today, where the Police got the song title Tea in the Sahara from, that being Sheltering Sky, which they actually reference in the lyrics. But I was 12 years old when I first heard it, so sue me. Anyway, always be learning. Now, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time around is the writer Boris Fishman, who has a new memoir out called Savage Feast: 3 Generations, 2 Continents, and a Dinner Table, a memoir with recipes. It's from HarperCollins. Our mutual pal Dmitry Samarov introduced us, which is another branch on the great mind map I keep of all my guests and where they came from. There are a couple of nodes, people who've just referred me to more people or opened the door to other people, and it's always kind of neat seeing that laid out graphically. Anyway, Boris. Boris emigrated from the Soviet Union in the mid to late 1980s at the age of 9, moving through Vienna and then Rome, and landing in the Russian enclave of South Brooklyn. And he writes about that world in his first novel, A Replacement Life, which is filled with colorful and semi-factual, semi-made-up stories about Jews from Minsk, mainly his family. With Savage Feast, he takes the veil of fiction off of that world and relates his family's harrowing history during the war and the Holocaust, the drudgery of life in the Soviet Union for a Jewish family, even a non-observant Jewish family like his, and the culture shock of life in the West. And at the same time, he's charting the story of his own development as a writer and and as a human being, and as well, not exactly an American, which we'll talk about. But for Boris and his family, all of those aspects I mentioned, they're all associated with food, and Savage Feast doubles as a cookbook. Almost every chapter ends with recipes of the dishes that are part of the story from the preceding chapter. Food is the medium of communication for a lot of figures in Boris's extended family, not just the nuclear one that got to the U.S. And that includes the Gentile Ukrainian lady who serves as his grandfather's caregiver, who's kind of a central figure throughout this. The subtitle of the book is A Memoir with Recipes, and it's that motif that makes Savage Feast even more special, because it combines Boris's wonderful prose, his observations, the near impossible family history, the pathos of his own life arc and development, and wraps it up in this sensory delight of food and what the community eating means. Anyway, when Dmitri set up me and Boris, I'm pretty sure he figured the two of us were going to hit it off as people and as friends, and just share stories throughout the course of the podcast. And that does happen a lot during this conversation, which gets us to the caveats. I talk a lot this time. Other than that, there wasn't a lot else. We recorded this one at my home because Boris's parents left South Brooklyn. Now they live a few towns over from me. So he was delighted to get away from them for a little while and come out to my house. That means there's the occasional reference to the woods outside and my wife's cookbooks on the shelf behind me. Also, my mic level was a little low. So there's, well, just a little bit off when you listen to the playback. Boris also had to get home that evening on a strict timeline for parenting duties, and he kind of missed that time, but I noticed it, so we ended a little abruptly because I didn't want him getting in trouble on my account. That said, we've stayed in touch since then by email, and hoping we'll get together for another session when he's got a little more time. Now here's Boris's bio from Savage Feast. Boris Fishman was born in Minsk, Belarus, and emigrated to the United States in 1988. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The New York Times Book Review, Travel and Leisure, The London Review of Books, New York Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian, among other publications. He is the author of the novels A Replacement Life, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and winner of the VCU Cabell First Novelist Award and the American Library Association's Sophie Brody Medal, and Don't Let My Baby Do Rodeo, which was also a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. He teaches in Princeton University's creative writing program and lives in New York City. His new book is the memoir Savage Feast. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Boris Fishman. Memoir? Where did the idea for Memoir start for you? The structure of it with food and recipe, and the difference between writing this and writing your novels?
Well, we can talk about those three alone for
I know. And I'll keep cutting you off and interjecting other stuff. But
so my great dream was nonfiction was my first passion. Mm-hmm. I think I started reading literary writing in college, and I found it in the New Yorker. And in the late 90s, the New Yorker was a more literary publication than it is now. Sure. All the way through. I think it's still literary in the bookends. I mean, the critics, less so in the well. And I'll never forget coming across a Brian D. Salvatore profile of Merle Haggard. Mm-hmm. And that thing read to me like the best novels I'd ever.
Well, it's like David Gates doing Ralph Stanley in the New Yorker, plus a Charles Burns illustration to go with it. But yeah.
Exactly.
And Ron Rosenbaum, also from that era, who was just hitting home runs.
Basically, the experience was there was nothing about this that couldn't be as creative, as stylized in the best sense of the word. When I say stylized, I mean distinctive without being exhibitionist. Just so interesting and creative and as inventive as a novel in every sense but the fact that it was factual. So it was my first passion. That's what I wanted to do. To make a long and frustrating story short, I never got to do it in the way that I wanted to. On paper, it seems like I did because I worked at the New Yorker. I wrote for places like the New York Times. It all looks good. It all looks
a nice resume.
Yeah. But the resume has no bearing on what it felt like. And eventually I understood that the industry where it was, as I've learned since, it's a vanishing chance, but where I still had a vanishing chance to write as narratively, as sort of where voice could be as prominent as I wanted it to be was fiction. And that's why I turned to novels. But the original interest never went away. And I get a special charge out of writing something that happens to be true, but in a style that's as labored over as the best creative nonfiction is. So I'd always wanted to write something that would have to go in the creative nonfiction category. That's where this comes from. The other reason is that it just happened to be true, the story that I wanted to tell. And the truth of it, I thought was engaging enough. Somebody said the other day, I did a book club at a bookstore, and the person leading the book club said that the novels read to me like nonfiction, and the memoir reads to me like a novel. There's a density of ideas, especially in the first novel, that make you pause and go slowly, whereas there's something about the memoir has a driving narrative and makes you turn the page in a way that makes you feel like you're reading a novel. I don't know.
And I think in my case in particular, I went from one right to the next. So in a sense, the Savage Feast, the memoir, was almost not like Cliff's Notes, but it was sort of this is all the material that became a replacement life.
Exactly.
Not all of it, but you could see all these different routes and parallels to what you were doing in the novel.
Well, you're a careful reader, right? Like
and it was again back to back. If I'd read one, 8 years earlier, it may not have been
perhaps
as direct.
Yeah, there's lots of you could map it if you wanted to. So for me, I can't say then ultimately that writing Savage Feast as a process was very different from writing the novels, because it has to have a narrative arc. The characters have to change, evolve, develop, alter, kind of in the same way that they do in a novel, because A, that's how people change in real life. B, novels do mean to say something. At least my novels do mean to say something about real life. So sort of the most significant way in which it was different from writing a novel is I had to make sure it mostly answered to fact. And the reason I say mostly is because creative nonfiction, I think, legitimately allows you to play around with fact in ways we could discuss, but probably won't surprise you. And also because I'm not the first person to say this, but it's impossible to establish certain facts with complete accuracy. For example, I don't really remember much of my childhood. Kind of a deterrent to writing a reliable memoir. So what I did was I interviewed my parents. Then I tried my best to, as conscientiously as I could, I tried my best to correct for what I think their falsifications are. Right? The way in which they rosy certain things up and blacken others. Right. And so I put that in the book. Is that true? Did that really happen? If I'm within 15 degrees of what happened, I would be very satisfied. But,
it's not a legal document.
It's not a legal document. And I think that we read novels. It's so interesting to me. We read novels trying to sniff out what really happened. Right. And we read memoirs trying to sniff out what didn't really happen.
They're faked. Yeah.
So as long as you're aware of that, it can be an interesting process.
Well, there's nothing James Fry like. There's nothing that's, and then my entire life changed because of a thing that I just made up and told you. Everything fits. And again, there's a sense of evolution throughout it. One thing I found interesting, it's a memoir about your family, not about you specifically, although you're the central figure in it. That boundary aspect of a tight-knit family and that sense in which the lives are shared like this. I didn't have that. So it's interesting seeing that and seeing, how it shapes the memoir along with your first novel, that it's.
Which part of it didn't you have?
A close-knit family. We had a family that was nuclear and had no relatives or anyone else around us. But this is where I grew up, out here in the woods. So there wasn't like this bigger community, this greater sense of, fitting into a cultural context.
Oh, I see. The reason I'm asking is because...
Also, we all didn't talk too much.
Right. So both the nuclear family wasn't particularly close-knit, and there wasn't this omnipresent and perhaps suffocating community of people around it. Because we actually have like Russia, the Soviet Union I guess, unofficially had the one-child policy before China did, largely because there was only so much money to provide for your young. Mm-hmm. And I'm an only child. My mom's an only child. My dad has only one sibling. For the most part, it was like this. And then we all know the number of siblings that disappeared during the war for a variety of reasons. So there was no great extended family. Also, there's like, Soviet people are very suspicious of everyone they have the opportunity to be suspicious of. And so even people who theoretically had the opportunity to be close often weren't close in a way that I'd describe as genuinely close.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And it carries over
that
to
holds up.
Right?
My family my father was a refugee from Romania to Israel. My mom was born in England, but in 1940, so the Blitz, rationing, etc. So they both had lives that were deeply shaped by the war and how they related to people afterwards. Yeah.
So even though she was born in 1940, she wasn't too young to experience, well, I guess you osmose just a general sense of privation and terror and uncertainty.
Yeah, as a little kid, again, she's post-war rationing, etc.
Right.
It's,
she
5, 10
old
years
enough
old.
by then.
Right.
So where do they meet?
Israel, socialist Zionist family. She moves to Israel, very early 60s, meets dad, comes to America, and then they ended up at the terminal point in Jewish history here in Ringwood, New Jersey.
Ringwood, New Jersey. May I ask, are they still around?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just corresponding with Mom about something for an essay that I'm writing about Dad.
Right. So let me ask you, if you wrote a memoir with whatever you deemed to be the degree of revelation and candor of the one that I wrote, how would they react?
Oh, terribly, which is one of my questions. Your family happy or mad about you mining their lives for both novel and memoir?
They've been pissed since the beginning. I hardly had to write a memoir for them to get pissed at me. And I have to say that I've become much more understanding and appreciative of why. I've tried very hard never to be cheap with what I say about anyone who isn't me. That said, I think their objection is to the airing of any laundry, any kind of revelation that doesn't reflect beautifully on who they are and how blameless their intentions are, because their intentions are perfect. They are lovely, generous people who have a very hard time understanding or accepting that the best intentions don't often end in the best consequences. Everything for them is sort of whitewashed by the fact that the intentions were good. So they have a very hard time with what I think is unavoidable if you're going to try to write an honest piece of fiction or nonfiction, which is to represent characters in 3 dimensions. Who is interested in pure saints or pure villains, in addition to the fact that that's not a faithful representation of who they are? To me, what makes them important is that they are so multifaceted, but they come from a culture that just finds it incredibly trying, to say it charitably, to have any private matters presented on the page. So they've had a hard time with it for a very long time. And it's part of the reason that I would really love book number 4 to have nothing to do with any kind of recognizable personal history, because I'm done upsetting.
So this is your Nathan Englander Ministry of Special Cases time. You need to write about Argentina's dirty war for 700 pages. And
I need to go to Argentina or something, because I've had enough. The problem is,
you don't want to be identified as that guy who keeps writing about his Russian family.
That's true.
Yeah.
Though I think there are a lot of readers who wouldn't mind it. I think my second book was my special Ministry of Special Cases. I think if we talked about it, there are all these ways. In fact, I understood this only in the course of writing the novel. Ultimately, this one, too, was quite autobiographical, even though I was writing it from the perspective of an adoptive mother. I'm not, at that point, I wasn't a parent. I'm not a woman. I haven't been adopted. I'm not an adoptee. I thought I was writing from further away from my history than I ever had before, and turned out not quite to be the case. But I would love to be done mining this material for multiple reasons. The problem is the place and the time and the stories that I come from, more of which come tumbling out with the years, because
I never told you about your grandfather, but
exactly, yeah. Especially now that all the grandparents are gone, they're so damn good.
Yeah.
They're so interesting. They're so compelling. They're not only narratively and dramatically compelling, they tap into issues that to me feel more compelling. So America right now is going through an extremely turbulent moment, right? And if you are a certain kind of conscientious attention-paying person, you really care about some of the things that are, some of the issues that are roiling American life right now. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm concerned, but I am attached to them far less than some of the issues that, for example, I get into in these novels. World War II, the Holocaust, post-war history, ideas like memory and guilt and identity and belonging, those things are far more interesting to me than American gun culture. As critical as I find it for us to do something about that issue, I have zero interest in writing a novel about guns.
There's also a degree, and I've seen this with a couple of contemporary novelists I've recorded with in recent months, where they think that writing a novel is going to change the culture.
It's another good point, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, we're all
not in that age.
We're all allowed our illusions, right? We can, right? In my second novel, I thought that by writing a novel from the perspective of a woman, I would be making a valuable contribution to the debate about identity appropriation and all sorts of other things. Yeah, right. Nobody cared. I mean, also ideological novels are a whole other problematic category that we can discuss separately. I don't think it would be smart to write a novel about gun culture. It's just there are lots of things. There are a lot of dystopian aspects of American culture right now that I think could be creatively explored in a novel. I'm just perhaps not the right person to explore them.
Having a childhood in dystopia. Would you say, again, you don't remember too much of your childhood itself? Do you feel that emigrating from the Soviet Union at 9,
yeah.
Okay, and then Vienna, Rome to Brooklyn, blessing or curse in terms of that particular, it being that age that you came over in?
It's both.
Yeah,
both.
I know there's no control group you can test it against, but
so this is an interesting issue because it wasn't quite a dystopia. It was quite nice in a lot of ways, except for one. We're Jewish, and Jews were treated like second-class citizens in the Soviet Union. My family had problems because of that. I think also members of my family resented the fact that they couldn't earn freely, right? That their talents and skills and the sort of the money and profit and earnings they could bring in, the kind of security and comfort they could bring in, were artificially limited by the Soviet economic philosophy, which was a command economy, limited salaries. You know, whether you're a janitor or a physician, you're making roughly 100 rubles a month, the end. Well, my grandfather, to put it charitably, was a very entrepreneurial guy, spent most of his life on the wrong side of Soviet law, as you probably guessed from my books. Yeah. And he hated the fact that all the money that he made under the table had to go under the mattress. In any case, these people knew how to function in that society. They had no intention of leaving until I was born. I was born in 1979, and finally they were like, we gotta go. We don't want this kid to serve in the Red Army. The Red Army is vicious in its hazing even to people who aren't Jewish, let alone Jews. But by the time they resolved to go, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The Americans boycotted the Moscow Olympics in 1980, and all of a sudden the Soviets decided to retaliate by closing the doors to Soviet Jews and Soviet Jewish immigration. And so I was about to leave at 0 or 0 plus.
That's close to.
Yeah. I would have been a completely different person. Instead, I left at 9. It took us another 8 years to make it out. Though, let me actually argue against myself, because what I think makes me Soviet to this day deeply is not how many years I spent in that country, but how many years I spent under my parents' roof as a human being, regardless of what country that was in. Because they remain largely Soviet people, and you continue marinating in that somewhat toxic psychological juice if you're living under their roof, or at least if you're the kind of son that I was, an only child who experienced his sense of duty very acutely, never broke off, never really rebelled in a complete, meaningful way. And so I was a thoroughly Soviet person until 24 when I moved out. I mean, I technically left for college, but it was only an hour away.
How do you characterize the Sovietness of your parents?
Perhaps the most prominent aspect of it to me in a daily sense is you have a real hard time speaking directly. Because you're afraid of offending because you're afraid to own your needs. You're overly concerned about what other people are thinking. You don't trust the other person fully. This goes socially. This goes within the family. It goes within the extended family. If you're a certain kind of Soviet person, you are skeptical of everyone's motives all the time. You're not a risk taker. You, guilt, even more than sort of guilt is a beloved weapon within American Jewish culture. Well, it's
double whammy.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. It's a neutralized weapon compared to the way it's used in Soviet Jewish families. And there's a lot of duty. There's a real emphasis on duty and the things we owe each other, whether we feel like owing them to each other or not. And I think I just started developing in my late teens and early 20s a really, really intense acute allergy to this way of living. And I think I've built myself as a human being in angry rejection of that and in response to it. And part of the reason that my parents and we have a very close relationship to this day, but it is in some ways strained because I make a point of speaking very directly. The Russian is v lob, into the forehead. I speak very directly about what I believe in and what I need, and they can, to this day, can't bring themselves to do so. And it creates a lot of misunderstanding and tension and difficulty in a relationship that does not have the option to dissolve. We're going to remain in each other's orbits.
That dissolves interesting because you would have been just approaching teenage years as the Soviet Union itself collapses. Did that permeate your life there in Brooklyn, the way the Soviet Union was falling apart? Or was it something you were oblivious to and it was just coinciding with your own teenage rebellion?
Completely oblivious to it.
But it might be a theme for your next book. I'm just saying.
No, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
It makes me want to
full of those. I just don't actually follow through, as you guess from all the
It makes me want to ask my parents how much they cared about what was going on there.
Even trying to keep some sense of stability while the world that they knew. Only because I have a friend who I'll bring up later on in this, who has a child with no nationality.
Meaning?
Moldovan family. They came over here. Their second and third kids were born in the U.S. The first one was born in the Soviet Union in Moldova, and they never did her citizenship or paperwork, so she technically does not belong to any nation.
Wow.
Because you see those during the Olympics when they have the introduction, they have all the different nationalities, and you get 6 or 7 people who are people of no nation, and that is my pal Konstantin's first child.
That's fascinating. It's symbolic and metaphorical.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's so literary, but we can't really, again, rely on someone like you to actually do something with it.
No, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Especially these days when all of a sudden everyone's gone crazy on the subject of identity and borders and those boundaries, real and invented. So that's actually an interesting idea.
Yeah, feel free to write stuff down.
We may reconvene on this subject sometime down the line.
You live close enough. We can get together. I can share notes with you on this sort of stuff. And in fact, that's a question that ties back into the memoir. When I last connected with Konstantin and his family, we were in Chicago, and they took me and my wife to a Soviet restaurant. And I was puzzled because I figured I didn't know anything about Soviet cuisine versus the cuisine of the individual countries these people came from. But to them, a Soviet restaurant was comfort food.
Did the restaurant bill itself as Soviet?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And I wonder in relation to...
How confident of them.
In relation to the recipes and the food that your book circles around.
So
dive into. I was afraid, by the way, at the beginning that it was going to be like The Debt to Pleasure by John Lanchester, where the recipes themselves were telling the plot, which it might be, but I'm just too much of a moron with food to understand that. So
No. I wanted to have recipes, but I wanted them
segregated.
Yes, okay. Exactly. So to answer an earlier question,
yeah,
the intensity of feeling created in my family by meals, both the cooking thereof and the consumption thereof, was so varied, complicated, intense, almost compulsive. There was an element of addiction, an element of neurosis, psychosis, every cis you can imagine, that it felt worthwhile to explore. Why did we eat in such a fevered way? Cooking is the only thing in my life that creates in me the same sense of transport, exalted transport, that writing does. And if I were ever to leave writing, something I contemplate on a regular basis because of how difficult it is a professional pursuit, cooking is what I think about. I'm not the world's greatest cook, but I'm a decent home cook. And I think when anyone subjects himself to schooling, one can become much stronger. And anyway, that's
there's a section in the book where you're working in the kitchen in a restaurant that I was going to say, I actually have it written down here, everything of going back to work in the kitchen, because that seems, the way the memoir works, to be a place of both peace and sort of energizing structure for you.
That's exactly it. It was both. Yeah. It was incredibly taxing and incredibly tranquilizing in a way that my very distractible brain really appreciated. One of my greatest liabilities, and you could say perhaps also pluses as a human being, is I have a very overactive brain, and anything that stills it is of great welcome. The only thing that's ever stilled it in addition to writing is cooking.
Addiction and compulsion with food.
Yes. So we spend 3 hours cooking and 3 minutes eating, and I'm only exaggerating slightly. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to explore why. And I started thinking about it and asking questions and interviewing my family. And I understood that it all goes back to experiences of scarcity. And I'm speaking probably about the war more than I am about pre-war life. Pre-war life for Jews in Minsk and Belarus, where we come from, it wasn't flush, but actually, according to my grandparents, there was enough of everything, especially because everyone had their own gardens, and the guy down the road had the milk, and the guy down the road had the beef, and whatever. There was a lot of barter. People got by. Nobody was taking jet-set vacations to wherever, but people had enough to go by. Some great stories came out of that, too. But with the war, there are these experiences of extreme duress and privation that leave a mark for the rest of your life. They marked my grandmother, who was a Holocaust survivor, for the rest of her life. And what that means is that she had an abnormal relationship to food after the war. And I can detail the ways in which. Then it passes down to the next generation because she would not let my mother stop eating, right? It's how you show love, and it's also how you show terror. And then my mother would not let me stop eating. And so there are all these ways in which as soon as the food appears before you, you swallow it down like a reptile before it has the chance to disappear for reasons that were put in place many generations ago. And so it's a combined experience of exhilaration and terror that for me had sort of no parallel in almost any other. And so I wanted to explore it both in the mind and in the kitchen.
And the process of actually putting together recipes for this and feeling like you were accurate. To me, it's the least similar to anything you've written before. And it's, as you see from all the cookbooks behind us here, my wife really digs this stuff. Going into that and making sure it actually works. So
I had this very smug idea that the recipes would be easy because they didn't involve creating sentences for the most part. and I couldn't have been more wrong. It is so very difficult to write recipes, not least because they involve chemistry and other kinds of science, and I couldn't be less disposed to those arts. Add to that the fact that 1/3 of the recipes come from my grandmother, and 2/3 of the recipes come from another woman that I'll talk about in a second. My grandmother never wrote down any recipes. She took them to the grave. And so my job was to recreate these recipes from scratch. My skills at the stove do not extend to recipe recreation. My parents could tell me that your grandmother made stuffed cabbage. She braised it in a quilt of sourdough rye bread and sour cherry jam. Go. And you're just like, well, where does that come in? I mean, I'm used to braises in some sort of liquid. How does bread and sour cherry jam combine to create liquid? So that took a minute. That was the challenge there. But it was also, I could create them directly. And what is the opposite of metric? Imperial?
Yeah.
Okay, so I could create them directly in imperial, right? Whereas the other recipes, which come from sort of the other woman who's the kind of the hero of the story, she came into our lives shortly after my grandmother passed, and she took care of my grandfather until he passed 15 years later. She became a member of the family, and she became the healer of the family because she was such an amazing cook that her meals always succeeded in drawing me back to a family table that I was kind of ready to leave in a lot of different ways. Now, her recipes, A, not written down, B, in metric, to the, once I finally got her to try to translate what the pinch in her mind correlated to numerically, she would say, well, 300 grams. And then I had to figure out a way to translate that to the imperial system. Then I had to test the recipes. I tested all the recipes myself. It was, even though on and off I worked on the book for 6 years, easily the hardest part was the recipes.
Would you say the food bill exceeded your advance? Well, when we talk about how difficult publishing is.
Well, the great secret is that the only way that I'm actually able to survive in New York City is because I do most of my food shopping down in South Brooklyn, which is full of these wonderful emporia where everything is twice as nice and half the cost. Mm-hmm. Net cost, I believe, is actually the name of one of them. It's one of my favorites. The food bill was high and certainly not one I anticipated, but I enjoyed it in the end.
Yeah.
I was educated by it in the end, but it was one of those like roadblocks that I didn't really anticipate when I started out. I won't be writing any more cookbooks. Let's put it that way.
And if you pick up, we have the Veselka cookbook here somewhere. So at least you get the Ukrainian recipes.
What do you think about Veselka?
I like it in principle. In theory, nice.
It wasn't a test question.
Yeah.
It frustrates me that as decent as that restaurant is, that's most people's notion.
That's what I was going to say. That I had the authentic Ukrainian experience here on 13th Street or something. Yeah,
9th and 2nd.
That's
yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
Meh. Now there's Sammy's Romanian.
I've actually never been to Sammy's Romanian.
I've heard it's great, but my old man is Romanian. I've got to haul him out there at some point. And again, he fled around 8 years old, 8.5. To get to Palestine at the time, to give you an idea of how far back it goes. And in fact, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask about the privation, et cetera. For my mother's side, growing up under rationing, it was very much about hoarding and protecting. My father, getting to America, was much more about flaunting and showing that you've arrived and succeeded. Did that play into...
Totally, yeah.
I'm sure you saw it in other families in South Brooklyn.
It's a dichotomy that actually played out in my family just in a slightly different way. Before we go on, I just want to say about Sammy's Romanian Steakhouse is that the only thing I remember about it, I don't remember if this was on their website, their promotional materials, or somebody said it to me, but wherever this came from, it said, the steaks at Sammy's are so big, the ends hang off the plate like ears. And that's just a beautiful literary image that I may have reused.
I will give you this one. We'll leave it in because this is us reminiscing on our families. Back in the 60s, my parents come to America. They're living in New Jersey. They go to a restaurant, Chinese restaurant, a Holiday Inn in Paramus on Route 17 or Route 4. It's gone now, but they go there. They're ordering the fish special, and the Chinese waiter keeps shouting at them something. They don't understand what he's saying, but they insist, no, fish special. So they order it. He leaves. A few minutes later, he comes back in with this plate that's enormous with a fish hanging off of both ends of it. Everybody in the restaurant is turning to stare. My parents suddenly realize what he was trying to tell them. That it's way too much for two people. And boom, drops it right on the table like the Flintstones thing where they put the brontosaurus on the drive-through of the car and it flips over. Basically that size meal. So it's one of the few stories my parents have that doesn't involve one of them being mad at the other one. So
stories they funneled through you, perhaps.
Yeah, there's just the occasional one that's just funny and not actually derogatory. So.
The thing that my parents, and I will answer your other question in a second, but the thing that my parents find most puzzling about my wife, who is not of Soviet extraction, nor Jewish, is that even though there's only a little bit left on the plate, she's able to leave it there. Once she's decided she's full, she really is. Yeah. It is mystifying to them. But to answer the question that you asked, to me this is fascinating because this memoir is in some senses about food, but for me it's actually about trauma. And something I find fascinating is the way different kinds of people react to trauma. My grandmother and her sister were orphaned by the war. Their grandmother, Minsk, was the westernmost major Soviet city. It's where the Germans invaded. My grandmother could see German paratroopers up in the sky coming down June 22nd, 1941. And her grandmother refused to be herded into the ghetto that was created soon thereafter. And she suffocated herself behind the furnace that they used to make their meals and heat the house. Her parents and her grandfather were murdered in the ghetto in a way that is dramatically intense in addition to being horrifying. They were orphaned by the war. And the two of them could not have reacted to that experience in more different ways. There's a kind of person that responds to trauma by, I think, living as if the next installment of it is right around the corner. And that was my grandmother's sister. She hoarded every ruble, never bought anything, was very careful with her expenses. Even her appearance was very monastic. She didn't speak much. She didn't laugh much. She never joked. You never saw makeup on her. My grandmother was the kind of person that lives in the pretense that the trauma is never going to happen again. And it's a pretense, right? Yeah. But it's a necessary pretense to survival. And you never met a more exuberant, extravagant, profligate person. She loved throwing money at various things. She had, her hair was half a foot off her head. She had this exquisite pink net that she slept in every night because the hair had to stay flawless. Yeah. Exactly. She had this one gold tooth in the front of her mouth, and so everything she said had this fabulous gleam around it. And we always had more food in the house than we needed. Right? Never just enough. Always more than we needed.
To throw out bread.
I tell that story in the book. We always had to have 5 loaves of bread on hand. As soon as that bread lost its first freshness, as we call it, people, and I love this about Soviet culture, by the way. Some of the scarcity makes you take care with things that we don't take care with things in America because there's so much, there's plenty here, and B, the replacements are so cheap. Mm-hmm. There, the ingenuity and resourcefulness of people in finding new uses for things is so endearing to me, even though it comes from a kind of artificial scarcity, right? Yeah. So people reused old bread for stuffing, for breadcrumbs. Never my grandmother. That bread went into the trash. She loved dolling up. She loved lots of outfits. And so in my family, sort of, on my mother's side, she was my mother's grandmother, right? The experience was of extravagance and show. On my father's side, it was a little bit more like my grandmother's sister. And so there are both strains in my background, and I have the option of drawing from either.
We think we have the option, but we're actually driven.
Very, 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 very true. Very true.
I combine the hoarding and flaunting in really weird respects, but
Totally, you're absolutely right. We don't really choose. And it's kind of astounding at 40, speaking of 40, to realize how much is not really up to you, even though you've spent a very responsible 20 years in therapy, even though you've sort of walked out of all sorts of roofs that you're supposed to have walked away from. And having just had a daughter who's about to turn 5 months, I'm fascinated to find out the ways in which some of the very same things are going to show up in her. I hope in a very watered down form, but they will.
Or at least that you help mitigate them. That's one of the... You've listened to the show a bunch of times and you probably wondered, why is there nobody under the age of 40 on this podcast? It's because I want people who've seen patterns and seen their own patterns going by. Just a few weeks ago, the great cartoonist I recorded with, Seth, it's a 3rd/4th time we got together. He'd said, all these years I thought I was doing these cartoons about old men and that they were my father. And I finally realized that these were all about me. All these years I was actually making comics about myself and didn't quite realize I was replicating all these patterns.
It's both humbling and frustrating and comforting.
Yeah. There's continuity, but you also you know that you're still, it's not predetermined. You still have to figure out your own life and what you're trying to do.
You have some say. It's just not as much as you thought in your 20s, somewhat self-regardingly.
During the book, on page 196 in particular, you mentioned the alternative Borises, the possibility that your grandparents' stories, on your mother's side in particular, which were so chance and fate driven, could have ended up differently. And you think of all the different versions of yourself that could have existed from that. How much of that drives you in terms of fiction and drives you in terms of your day-to-day life in terms of, am I exactly who I think I am just because of all this chance?
You've gotten to the heart of why I write fiction, which is I'm an extremely particular person. I'm a particular person partly because I come from a culture that pretends not to be particular, the people in which pretend not to be particular even though they are, and then expect you to read between their lines so they never have to experience the burden of expressing directly what their needs are. Makes me insane, and as a grown-up I wish to avoid that. Partly because if you're trying to make it as a writer, are we allowed to curse on this podcast?
Oh, yeah. I always tell people, no one's listening. It's okay.
You can't really fuck around with your time if you're trying to become a writer. You're not going to be paid for it for a very long time. So you're probably having to earn your money in a different way, which means you're living two lives, and your 24 hours have to accommodate two lives, one of which is paying, one of which is not, both of which are very time consuming. So there's never a time when I could just sort of let time take its course, right? I had to drive and guide and control it myself. And so I could never stay on the phone longer than I wanted to. I could never spend more time in the supermarket than I wanted to. I had to be extremely efficient about everything to get everything I wanted to read and do in the limited time that I had. You could say, well, Boris, how much time does that allow for the kind of unguided, open-ended meandering that we all require in order to produce art? And my answer is sadly not much. That is the price of the way that I chose to do it. But for a variety of reasons, I have ended up as a pretty particular person. And so the self that I have in me, despite all the grand efforts I've made to escape it, is so assertive, is so domineering, is so particular that for me, I think I write fiction not least to imagine alternate identities, which feel incredibly liberating and exotic. I have such a hard time being anyone but myself, to my great detriment a lot of the time. And I don't preclude various blind spots and the like. That I think I use fiction as an escape from oneself. And so when I imagine an avatar of Boris on the page doing things that, my grandfather just said, fuck you to various forms of authority. I have a hard time saying fuck you even to my parents, let alone greater forms of authority.
You looked agonized saying it just now.
Yeah. I had to ask for your permission to curse on the podcast. Yeah, I am in some ways a very obedient citizen, which is a source of endless frustration for me. And so writing about characters who are not, in ways large and small, literal and not, is you forget to look at the clock, which is the only criterion I've ever had of a passion. A passion is something where you forget to look at the clock. And of course, I've made the rookie mistake that as long as you, and my first novel was partly about this, as long as you remove yourself geographically from the place where you experience yourself as a problem, everything's going to change. That, of course, is complete bullshit, because you take your brain with you. But part of the reason I love to fantasize in idle and useless moments about alternative Boris is because we've had so many opportunities to end up in different places. As I mentioned in the book, my great grandfather was he was a POW of the Germans during World War I. And a lot of those POWs, stayed in Germany. What if he'd chosen never to come back to what was by then the Soviet Union? What if he'd remained? Would he have been in the German army during World War II? Would we have been German Jews? Like, would we have tried to immigrate? Would we have gone out in time? Where would we have gone? Would we have gone to Palestine? Would we have gone to Zimbabwe to Argentina to all these places where Jews got scattered. You know, half of Lithuanian Jewry ended up in South Africa. I went to South Africa in 2014 and experienced a very intense connection to what I saw around me, a more intense connection than I have felt in some other places. It made me wonder what my life would have been like had we ended up there, and whether I would have made a better match with South Africa than I have with America, a match that is far less tight than I wish it were. Are there places in the world where my adopted home would have felt more home-like? These things can both keep you up at night and fuel a lot of creative output.
Did you ever think about Israel? I know the idea when you first emigrated, the whole idea was to pretend you were going to see family in Israel, but actually, head off to America. Had that ever been a interest either for your family when they were getting out or in your later days?
I think no, because one is a reason that's sort of neutral.
Too many Russians there?
There are too many Jews there.
Yeah. I always said, why did your father leave Israel, Gil? I said, because it was a country filled with Jews. There was no one he could hustle. He had to come to America to find some people to flee. So
that would have been my grandfather's answer.
Yeah, that was exactly. Trust me, reading your both Replacement Life and Savage Feast, I thought, my old man fit that same mold.
Yeah,
just a generation later.
And it's a type that I think is endlessly fascinating to us because we are such law-abiding fools so much of the time.
Sometimes in response.
In response to
we see that a predecessor was a con artist, etc., and have to want to be like that.
Now, I don't know whether your father was like this, but my grandfather worked very hard. Here's a perfect example of Soviet self-deception. He was required by my grandmother and by some sense of conscience of his own to turn me into the opposite of who he was. That's why we brought you here, right? At the same time, he wanted to be vindicated in everything that he did for himself and for the family by seeing strains of the same in me.
Yeah.
And so, but of course, all of this happened without any clear explanation of what the hell he meant or was talking about, because so much of what he got up to was never shared with me on my grandmother's orders, even though my grandfather would have been only too happy to brag to me about all the very clever things that he got up to. We call it naleva, on the left. Here it's under the table. To us, it's on the left. And so I got a lot of very contradictory messaging from him about the kind of person I was supposed to be. This wasn't only in regard to sort of, financial endeavors. It was with everything. It was with regard to women, right? I was to treat women like fragile petals and also fuck their brains out, because
this is the schism of how you're gonna.
Yeah. And I couldn't understand the reasons why in either case. Do you know what I'm saying? Why were we talking about the way that he was?
Being a hustler.
Israel, Jewish.
Yes.
So I want to clarify what I meant, because it's not something to say lightly. The Soviet experience was an experience of atheism. Mm-hmm. And this is a part of Soviet life that really resonated with us. And it made sense to us voluntarily that there was no God, and that religious observance was just a kind of great opiate. It made sense to us. And so even though so much of Israel is secular, though in key ways less so today, I would find it very hard to live in a place so much of the identity of which was determined by a religion. Mm-hmm. Now, as an aside, I'm very responsive to those people who say I understand, Boris, that you identify with Jewishness culturally, and proudly so. There would be no Jewish culture without Jewish religion.
Yeah.
And that is a conundrum that I think about all the time, not least because what am I going to pass on to my daughter? My wife is not Jewish. And I don't want my daughter to walk through life with a merely cultural sense of Jewishness, because it's going to be even more watered down than mine. Mine is powerful not because of religion, because of what my grandparents experienced. I'm going to pass all those stories on to my daughter, but I wonder if it'll be enough for her because of the context she's growing up in.
Yeah, so you're going to be defining it by persecution.
Right.
And otherness.
Right, exactly.
But without the identity that inspires the otherness, it's missing something.
The identity.
And not to tell you how to raise your kid.
No, but you're absolutely right.
That's
and the identity, there's no getting around the fact that the identity is created by sort of the roots of it are religious. The other thing about Israel that I'd like to point out is it is extremely small.
We're in New Jersey. It's about the size of New Jersey.
It's the size of New Jersey. And I think one of the things that I appreciate tremendously about America, it's one of the things that helps me feel at home here when so much culturally alienates me here, is its size, its openness. I have the same very intense attachment to the American West that I did to South Africa for whatever reasons. I remember I went on a kind of cultural ambassadorship to Latvia and Estonia for the State Department. And those countries felt so cloistered to me. The knowledge that the border was merely an hour or two away in every direction was extremely confining. It was an experience of geographic claustrophobia that I've never experienced before. You know, the Soviet Union was enormous. America's enormous. I think I depend on places to be enormous.
Did you ever have issues traveling to countries that had a horrible Holocaust history?
Issues in the sense that it's painful to observe the ways in which people barricade themselves from the facts about what happened. Yeah. But people,
to the point of deterring you from any of those trips.
From going there, I wouldn't go to Hungary now. I think Hungary sucks. Mm-hmm. You could say, well, there's a lot of very well-meaning and innocent people who are suffering under and chafing under the kind of leadership that they have now.
A pal of mine who is married to a Hungarian woman, they went back recently, Gentile. Budapest is blue state. The rest of the country is red. He said everybody in Budapest, like, why is he like this? You know, can't we just, be part of the European world? And everybody outside of the major cities, it's just, the Jews, they're the ones bringing us down. And yeah.
It's heartbreaking. And autocrats love holding blameless people hostage to their insane philosophies. The Russian people as a whole are far better than who Vladimir Putin is. Vladimir, I should say correctly.
In case he's listening.
Don't want to mispronounce his name. That's not a form of disrespect I ever wish to deploy. But we're also careful about where we put our dollars, right? Organic only, please. And is this money going, but so for that reason, why shouldn't that also relate to, travel? Ireland is liberalizing in a very progressive and sort of, to me, encouraging way. Costa Rica has no army. There are all sorts of places that I think are moving in the right direction, and other places that aren't. And I understand one's dollars affect lots of different things, many of them deserving. But Austria, I went to Austria a year ago, and I'm not sure I'd go back, even though I had a fantastic time. I had a fantastic time because Vienna is stuck in like the 1980s, 1990s in a way that I find absolutely delightful. But what that means today is it's not a global city. Yeah. What that means today is it's not like many other places. You go to experience what's hip in Paris or London or Sydney or Tel Aviv or New York. It's identical. It's Brooklynized.
It's global culture.
Yeah. And global culture is depressing. To me, sameness is depressing. Anything that you did not sort of decide to do and express in a way that accords with your own very particular history is depressing. The problem is that Austria is completely amnesic, completely. And there's just a general right-wing cast to everyday life there that is incredibly upsetting. And some places do live up to the stereotype, speaking of depressing experiences, and I'm not sure that I would return.
So where do you feel home? Or feel at home? Or do you ever?
No, very, very rarely. And I know that it can sound like a pose, my suffering self, right? But
you're a refugee.
I'm a refugee, but
it means something.
I'm over eager to feel at home, and I have fleeting experiences of it that I'm all too ready to point to and say that was an experience of home. I think I have a renewed appreciation for New York, and the reason for that is I was frustrated by certain things in New York that wouldn't be a surprise for anyone. My wife and I decided to move to Miami for a year. To see if sort of the ocean and the sun could cure it. And Miami was so upsetting in so many ways that can be just boiled down to, it was that much harder to find a good conversation, that it renewed my appreciation for New York, which makes us very happy returnees, repatriates to New York City. The open spaces of the American West are incredibly, they're almost parental. There are people who have written very articulately about the ways that a piece of rock can fill you with tranquility and serenity, I should say. That has been very true for me, especially when that piece of rock is very big. What I mean by parental is, in some recess of the mind, this thing is saying to me, like, I got this.
Yeah.
I've been around for longer than you have, and everything's going to be fine. We just went to a wedding in Bellingham, Washington. What's Bellingham, Washington? Except Bellingham struck me as a place where there's a real sense of community, and where money does not have the same priority. It's America. It's a capitalist place.
Yeah.
Money is money. But it just doesn't seem to have the same priority in daily interaction that it does in so many other parts of America, including New York, which is a very money-focused place, and where I am a very money-focused person, because everything is so goddamn expensive, and because I do something that is not well remunerated by this culture, which is something that I'll never forgive this culture for. I do come from a country where you were politically compelled, and that is an insurmountable problem. But you were also revered for being a writer and remunerated for it in a way that is just a fantasy in this country. So I really appreciated that about Bellingham, Washington, of all places. There are experiences I've had in Spain, which I've tried very hard to become a citizen of. I did the 23andMe test in the hope that I'd find some Sephardic blood that would entitle me to a reclaimed Spanish citizenship. I'm 99.8% Ashkenazi.
Oh. You didn't discover any weird family secrets, though, did you? I've had two different people I've met in the last year or so who've discovered their parents are not who they thought they were.
Is Dani Shapiro one of them? Do you know her memoir Inheritance?
I read about that. So
yeah, that is the premise of the memoir.
There was a Wall Street Journal piece also on these two sisters whose parents both died. They get tested. It turns out they're both half sisters, and that there is a half brother they knew nothing about once they start doing the associative thing with the testing. In my case, it was a pal who thought he was primarily Ukrainian, discovers a third Sicilian, and like, gee, Mom, what's the story there?
So like this is so interesting to me, because it's I would have loved to discover something like that, no matter how destabilizing it might have been.
Oh, the whole changeling myth is something we live on as you know, but from the artistic poseur, but you as an actual artist. So.
No, but I think the impulses within us all, I chose to channel it into fiction. But it's the reason I cited and want to in writing fiction. Like, the imagining of other lives for ourselves is incredibly liberating. It's incredibly liberating. The finality of oneself is just devastating. Do you know what I'm saying?
I'll tell you, my moment for this is 2003. I took one of the few actual vacations I've taken in my life that didn't involve work, family, or now the podcast. I was in New Zealand and had just had a breakup that was over-exaggerated, but breakups are breakups. And I was letting it get to me. I was letting other stuff get to me. I was on an adventure tour with a bunch of people I'd never met. And it hit me while I was hiking through Abel Tasman Park in the North Island of New Zealand that in the Southern Hemisphere, there were maybe 5 people who, if you said my name, would actually know who you were talking about. And that was my instance of, holy shit, all this baggage doesn't mean anything to any of them. Why does it mean anything to me? And it was completely liberating. Now, the funny thing was the misapprehensions people came up with, because in my goofy, jovial tone, I nonetheless had terrified the young Australian men who were on the tour, who were afraid to go to a pub with me because they thought I was Begbie from Trainspotting. And they had such a misimpression of who I was. Just because I would toss the occasional quip or line out there, they were just, oh my God, what's he going to be like when we get drunk? This is going to be terrible. They were horrified. And the next day they told me that, oh, thank God you didn't get into a fight. I'm like, what? You think I am? And that's, again, when you're taken out of your context. Much like the end of the Odyssey, when Odysseus has to go somewhere where they've never seen an oar before and they think it's a fan. everything means something else. You can actually be whoever you think you can be, whoever you want to be. I'm sure the patterns would keep recurring the longer
Well, who knows? Because I'm thinking of this moment. In 2005, I went to Mexico on an assignment for the travel section of the New York Times. At that time, Oaxaca was still a relatively undiscovered place for people from America. And I was absolutely enchanted by it for reasons that have a lot to do with why I struggle in America. The sense of community was palpable in a very different way. The food was spectacular. The sense of time seemed to work somewhat differently. It was very clear that the arts were valued in a completely different way. It was a superficial glance, but it was an attractive one. Mm-hmm. And I was so seduced by it, and I was on a constant lookout for another place to live, that I went. At that time, you had to go to an internet cafe or which had a phone booth, and I dialed my parents because they really needed to hear from me all the time to make sure I wasn't dead. And one of the first things I blurted out was, I want to move to Oaxaca. I wasn't trying to move to a war zone. I was just trying to move to a very charming city in southern Mexico, at which point my father said, and the thing that he blurted out was, but what about us? Mm-hmm. At which point I was flooded. If you've ever had a cigarette after a very long time of not having one, you can literally feel the nicotine spreading through to the tips of your cellularly, right? Molecularly. So that was how guilt flooded through me during that phone call, which I'll always remember. And I must have yelled something very, very defensive and angry in response. But guess what? No one moved to Mexico. I would have spent a great year living there if I'd gone to do it. There is an opportunity to have studied abroad in Spain that I forewent. There's a Fulbright that I got in Istanbul that I didn't take up. There are all these experiences that one turned down for reasons that as a younger person one perhaps blames on family or cultural issues. As you become older, you realize how complicit you were in the reasons why. There are all these lies that have been turned away. And there are so many conservatizing elements, not only of growing up, but of fatherhood. Speaking of, I was sitting in the Morristown Pancake House not long ago, and I had a thought that I have never had before, which was, what would keep a shooter from coming into this place? I've never had that thought before, even though guns have been a problem in the way they've been for quite a while. And as somebody pointed out, they said, Boris, you're a parent now. That's why you had that thought. Mm-hmm.
See, in my case, it was working in an office and recognizing, doing a betting pool basically to figure out who was going to be the guy who shows up. In my case, it was can I get up through those ceiling panels and actually balance well enough in those crawl spaces to get to the stairs and get out? Not can I help my fellow man, but it was do I have it? Because I have no window where I am. I'm going to have to go straight up and Spider-Man my way out of here. And I was pretty sure I could, but go on.
No, but like, if we can pause here, and you may wish to cut out this part, but if somebody from another planet came here and gazed upon us now, whatever is going on politically, as polarizing as it is, I think would pale in comparison to how insane they found the reality of gun culture.
Oh, yeah. I did one of these shows with Kyle Cassidy, the photographer, photojournalist. He did a book on gun culture. I'm blanking on the name of it, but I'll put it in the show notes. 3 or 4 days after Newtown, like the Saturday after Newtown. And at the time, we thought, well, obviously something has to happen after this. But once nothing happened after that, that was the clue. Nothing will.
Nothing. Yeah. So.
But yeah, you as a father are changing. But at the same time, when we talk about those alternative lives, I mean, you brought up that possibility for yourself now. Making that choice of, do I get out of writing and work in a kitchen, which I know would be demanding and a weird time thing and parenting, et cetera. But you do still think in terms of
absolutely
an actual change of life.
One desperately does not want to reiterate endlessly. Inertia grows enormously.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Right? Physically it does. Mentally it does. The kinds of things you'd have to turn upside down, the kinds of routines you'd have to upset. Except you're somebody far more attached to routines because of how many years you've spent enacting them. The costs are so great, except one does not want to spend so many years doing something strictly out of familiarity and comfort. And it's been, and there are ways one wishes to keep oneself alert by making those changes. The problem is that I have a child, a reality that, at least while she's 5 months, rewards a certain kind of routine. But it's not only about children. When you make a commitment to another human being, especially if until then you've been quite the lone eagle, responding only to your own needs because that's what's been right for your writing. I happen to be married to someone who professionally needs to be in New York City for the time being. Mm-hmm. And if it were up to me, and if I were single, the gun thing alone, the gun thing alone would send me to another country. I want to record my objection in an utterly meaningless way that will resonate with exactly no one. But it'll resonate with my conscience.
And that's very Russian.
It is very Russian. And I revere the old Russian writers. Everybody reveres them for their own reasons. Mine are that they, in a very non-relative, non-self-questioning way, accorded to themselves the authority to inquire after big things and imagine that there were unequivocal answers that didn't change regardless of your race, sexual orientation, gender, what have you. And we live in a time of such endless relativism that I find reassurance in what would today be seen as that kind of arrogance.
See, that's also part of the excuse I use for not writing. I figured nobody's looking for 48-year-old white Jewish guy's perspective on things. The market isn't there for me. Therefore, I don't need to write anything. See, I can make all the excuses in the world for not actually getting anything done. But my question that I always get to with anybody who has any background in Russian literature, but especially you, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy?
Turgenev?
I knew you'd go with a third person on that one, but I think that was Michael Tisserand's one also. He refused to deviate from that one. He studied Russian in Russian literature in college. But
before I answer that question, I want to turn it back to you.
Sure.
And ask you about that, about sort of the nearness to some kind of creative production
This is my art. It's bullshit art, but this is my art. That's what I've reconciled myself to.
But are you interested in writing something, or you've realized that you're actually ultimately more interested in this kind of conversation than you are in the writing?
Well, the guest who shall not be named, who canceled her episode after we recorded it, did point out that, if you haven't written anything, Gil, maybe you're not a writer. And I took that as, a positive that, again, ways of keeping me from, or permitting me not to do the thing that I was always supposed to do when I was young and for the last 48 years. It's a thing that I wrote about in that last podcast email that I sent out. It was a pal of mine and I talking about our alternative lives. And on the train home, I thought it was a subject that had come up in the past for the idea for a personal essay. I have a couple of short stories about an alter ego version of myself, which I'll send over to you after we finish, and you can say, "Oh my God, thank God he's not writing." Anyway, but yeah, the question of whether I would pursue an art, I've got this. In some respects, doing the podcast, while it is my creative outlet, also is a creative way to keep myself from making other stuff. I've got to do the show. I've got to edit this on Saturday. I've got to do the intro Sunday night. I don't have time in the morning. During the weekdays, I've got to get out and run. I've got to do the reading for all these guests.
I'll promise you I'll go to cooking school if you complete a book of short stories.
I will send you the first two Abe Lesser stories. And trust me, there is an Evernote file with 50 titles, concepts, etc., which I joked about in a past episode. John Crowley once said, well, you need to write the story about a guy who only writes the titles and concepts for stories. And there you go. And I wonder, with the idea of a personal essay that I had just started, whether that would suffice. I'll see as I get more time to work on that. Because, how do I put this? The show is the only form of conversation I have. I have business conversation, but really when you talk about Miami, this is the same thing. I live out in the woods. there's not a lot of people I don't interact with a lot of people. So there could be a lot of people who are readers here, and I just don't meet them because I'm a shut-in in some respects.
What I will say about Miami is that there was less to do, as there is almost anywhere that isn't New York City and places like it. And so I had a lot more time to do the things I cared about. So it's a strange trade-off. New York leaves you no time to accidentally discover a book you weren't otherwise meant to discover.
That's the nature of the show. I mean, that's why I ask at the very end, which I will ask you once we finish up, who you're reading. I got turned on to one of my favorite books in recent years by asking a political cartoonist that question when we were down at a cartooning festival in Washington. And he turned me on to something that had nothing to do with his field, nothing to do with my field, and it's one of the most amazing books I've ever read.
What's the book?
The Peregrine. I will give you a copy when we split. I've got a few downstairs for that very reason. By J.A. Baker.
No, I don't know it.
Basically nature writing, but almost like a prose poem. It is so astonishingly beautiful. I'd never heard of it. New York Review of Book Classics had just reissued it like a year earlier, and Matt Worker mentioned it. I'm like, yeah, I'll give it a read. I'll see what happens. Came across an article on it like 2 or 3 days later that also made it sound interesting. Picked it up and just blew my mind and changes the way I interact with this enormous natural expanse you could see behind us.
Noted. I have a file too.
Yeah. And that stuff just never happens without my interacting with people like you.
Let me ask you this. Since most of your guests have been over 40, I think I know the answer to this question. What percentage of them would you say have any faith in the MFA?
That's the joke I have about the younger guests is I get pitched by publishers who basically want me to interview someone who college MFA, worked in publishing, and then wrote a novel about college MFA and working in publishing. And I've no interest whatsoever in that. Most of the ones, there are a few who teach in MFA programs who are a little more, have something at stake when they endorse the whole program. Most of them, the vibe I get is that it's more about networking than about improving your ability to write. Some feel the workshop thing is just not how good writing comes about. But, I think I would have benefited had I gone into some sort of writing program. I think just the spur to produce would have been...
The reason I asked is because the one great thing that it did for me was I happened to have some great teachers who did teach me a lot about how to write. Yeah. Jonathan Lethem and Darren Strauss at NYU. But they were phenomenal teachers, in addition to the kinds of writers they are, which are two very different categories. Yeah. There are plenty of programs where you have named people teaching, but they're not good teachers. But the other thing that it did for me is that when you're writing, there's every reason in the world not to finish. It's an insurmountable thing to contemplate. And it taught me how to apply our carpentry-like regularity to it that sort of does not await any kind of particular moment in order to do it, because that moment will never come.
Right.
But if you become extremely self-serving and you decide that the hours of X to Y will be spent on this every day, by the law of accumulation in about 18 months or 24 or whatever it is, because there's so many people, there's so many reasons not to, financial, cultural, otherwise. Also, person X is devoted to making that paragraph perfect before he moves on to paragraph number 2. It's the best way never to. Yeah. And so
I know nothing about what you're talking about. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
So I do like to say that about MFAs. They were it was a very, it's true that in a workshop, you're primarily surrounded by people who, let's say, write differently than you do and their perspectives are of limited value. But if you're lucky, you'll meet a person who actually, this for me is a really weird alchemy. You're not necessarily close in quote unquote real life. You're not necessarily close, but for whatever reason, they have a line into you as a reader, and their insights are so useful. And I had a couple of people like that in the program, so that was very productive as well. Anyway.
Yeah, see, I've used this for that. The number of people I've actually, well, let me send you a story after we finish. The flip side of that is I do feel that my effectiveness of doing this is partly because I'm not in the field of the people who I'm recording with, that I'm not trying to break into publishing or cartooning, et cetera. Therefore, I can be a more entertaining conversationalist because I'm not professionally sucking up in any way.
I think that's extremely valuable, because the degree to which
careerism.
Yeah. My presence has deepened in this universe, and what I mean by that is there's just a lot more time that I spend on publicity, which is death by 1,000 paper cuts, and there's a lot more awareness that I have, even as I understand that every list, every review, every prize is more or less a kind of bullshit that has nothing to do with what you need to be doing. It is often information that's very hard to ignore and not have an emotional reaction to. Even though I don't go to any parties, I strenuously avoid every book review section that I can possibly avoid. I try to have as light a footprint as possible. I am not on Twitter. I get on Facebook only to announce an event of one kind or another. Nonetheless, it's impossible, and it is absolutely stalling. It is absolutely stalling. It's for me, it's very hard to avoid responding to it by thinking about what that means for my work, and that's just deadly. So the extent to which you can be outside of it, I think actually can be very, very generative.
My ideal work is to produce a zine at this point. Just produce something that isn't even online. That's just 32 or 48 pages of my writing, excerpts from the show, poetry, etc., and just mail that out to people. There doesn't have to be any commercial aspect to it. Again, as I always break it down, I'm a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry. You know, there is no, as you're telling me, there's no money ultimately in writing, and I have to live somewhat. I don't have to live in a grandiose manner, but I have to pay health insurance. I have this wonderful dog to take care of. You know, he's curled up in the chair. He took over the chair.
He looks very well.
Oh yeah, he sleeps in there overnight. I wake up and he'll just be flipped over, paws in the air, just curled up in that.
His ears hanging off the side of the plate.
But yeah, that's my whenever I mention the dream or my secret project at the end of episodes, that's what I'm talking about. Just producing an occasional booklet, basically, not quite chapbook, but you know, just something that's got what I wrote.
Much as with a breakup, indifference is a sign of progress, and hatred.
Yeah, it's a sign that you're not over anything. You're
right. So I was going to say, because the best sign of a good project is something that says "fuck you" to whoever it is, sort of whatever you define these unhelpful, distracting forces to be. But actually, far better than "fuck you" is "I don't care what you." It's very difficult to say "I don't care how you react" when your entire life depends on it.
Sure. Yeah. I couldn't handle the rejection of being a writer. That is part of my honest, thing as to why I don't pursue it, because I would not be able to deal with not just the rejection of being turned down by a publisher or a magazine, the rejection after a book comes out and nothing happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's,
I've seen enough of you guys go through that it's just like, I couldn't bear.
It's so difficult. Mm-hmm. It's so difficult. It never gets easier. Yeah, and so it's. But
at least you get invited to depressing podcasts like this.
but my wife is a therapist, and I said to her the other day, like, a writing career is an abusive relationship, by which I mean, like, sometimes it shows you a little love, and you come running back to it with everything you've got to give, everything, every corner of you is available. Yes, let's fly away together right now. And then as soon as it's got you back in its clutches, it turns away and gives that attention to somebody else. And you're sort of left picking your fingernails while you wait for its gaze to return.
I'll win them back. You'll see.
Yeah. How can I try harder? In what ways can I transform myself for this person to care for me again? Like, in the context of a relationship, any person who had your interest in mind would urge you to walk in the opposite direction. Now, I'm not talking about writing. I'm talking about a writing career, which are two very different things, right?
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no law against turning away from that back to your writing. But how are you going to live? What are you going to live on? And unfortunately, I'm I mean, I don't have any other passions other than cooking. So, but anyway.
I'm telling you, I'll finish the stories. You go to cooking school.
I made you promise.
What did you learn from teaching? You taught yourself also. You taught yourself. You were a teacher. Read card, good. So.
I'm a teacher even now. I teach part-time at Princeton. And I teach a creative writing workshop, and I co-teach a really cool class that brings in 60 students who have never taken an arts class before and gives them a crash course in 5 arts disciplines, of which fiction is one. And there is nothing quite so exhilarating as somebody whose eyes, which are connected to their soul, light up because they've had a glimpse of what writing can do for themselves, for the world, for no one at all. It is literally like, to use a very cheesy comparison, it is literally like a flower opening up in front of you. And I will spend all the time in the world to help that person along, creatively, professionally, however, whatever other adverb applies. There's very, very little about it that's fulfilling outside of that. It works off the same battery that writing does. It is incredibly time consuming. A lot of the time, the people around you don't care. Your students don't care. It is for them simply an elective. And that's a fact that you have to respect because you are their employee. Yeah. So teaching has mostly taught me that I would love to avoid it if I can. It's not a very original view. But in another, I guess, abusive relationship, there is often enough that student who lights up in response to it. And so you feel like you're building a secret army of people who are going to walk through the world looking at it in a way that is to the world's betterment. But even those people who are not particularly responding to it, the 59 students in that elective who are basically just going to yawn their way in order to get their passing grade, I would like to think, and I don't think I'm deluding myself, that you are planting a seed, not only that's going to grow into greater writing skill when they're applying for a grant 10 years from then to, I don't know, for something in their lab, or even a press release that they're writing for a congressman that they're representing. But it's just like I'm humanizing and dematerializing the way that they look at the world. And that particular seed may not sprout for some time, but I'm building like an auxiliary army in that case, an army in reserve. And it is my fuck you to the way that America is built. I think 107% of Princeton's graduates go on to work in law and finance, but
if they take a little of the Boris lesson,
if there can be a little bit of that floating around in them, that kind of, what do they call it, free radicals?
Yeah. So the reverse of cancer, but in the first book, in A Replacement Life, the girlfriend mentions revisiting books repeatedly and sort of measuring her changes. Not that the book has changed, but that she sees Garcia Marquez differently this time around. What do you return to?
Oh, it's a great question. Because some books stand up and some books doesn't. Some books doesn't.
Read card, good.
Yeah.
And are there books that got better as you got older? Not things you were assigned in class. It's a big thing of mine is the book I didn't get when I was young that it took a few years. I reread it and, I was a moron and the book got a lot better. There's
so many answers to this question. None of which, of course, come to mind right now because my memory is so terrible.
5-month-old child. I shouldn't have asked. But.
No, but even before the child, so one book. So Bernard Malamud. I don't know if that's a name that's known to you.
I know him, but I've never read him because I'm not a good Jewish.
Well, he's just like, I know how much you love Philip Roth, and. To leap ahead to the last question, the most recent book I read is Roth's Collected Nonfiction. And I respond much more to his nonfiction than I do to his fiction. Same with David Foster Wallace, by the way. They're like the two for whom that's true for me.
I've 100% with the Wallace thing, the fiction itself, meh, but nonfiction I can get something out of.
Totally.
Yeah. But Malamud,
have never finished a book by Bellow. Mm-hmm. I finished Henderson the Rain King just to shoulder my way through, and flung it across the field in which I was sitting when I finished it. It was at an artist residency in California. I think Roth and Bellow are both very American Jewish writers, whereas Malamud, to me, is a Russian Jewish writer. Yeah. There is, in every way, from the kind of broken Yiddishism, the Yiddishism that creates a broken English in his writing, this gorgeously mangled English, which is the English that I grew up with. My father speaks it to this day. It's the English that he speaks.
Which you capture in the Savage Feast. Yeah.
You know, he was the sort of the patron saint of a replacement life.
Yeah.
In everything from diction to, and he's much sadder than the other two. Mm-hmm. He's a downbeat creature who has only a very limited faith in the world's capacity to bring joy. And I just connected to that very much. And his books, The Fixer, but even more so The Assistant, have just stood the test of time in the most reliable way. Garcia Marquez, speaking of Garcia Marquez, lost his luster, right? When I was 18 and dating a very, very enchanting young Colombian woman, whose term papers I happily wrote about love in the time of cholera.
As one does.
Yeah, he took my breath away. I picked up 100 Years of Solitude some years later, and it all felt like foolish play, mannered foolish play. And
there are plenty of books we grow out of, certainly.
And that was one for me. I fell in love with an American writer named Jim Harrison, if that name is known to you. And
who I've only read, again, nonfiction and articles, given all the food writing and other stuff that he did. So.
Yeah, and you know, Jim perhaps wrote more quickly than he should have. I fell in love with him, with his writing, because of Legends of the Fall, which became a fairly cheesy movie, though it certainly wasn't cheesy to me when I was 15 years old and an awkward immigrant kid gazing upon Brad Pitt for the first time. I was like, now there's an American.
Yeah. I'm going to live up to that.
Yeah.
And then the hair went, and that was it. So.
And so I have, since discovering Legends of the Fall, which is a somewhat macho and somewhat chauvinistic book, but nonetheless was very meaningful to me when I was young. I proceeded to, Jim Harrison was the first writer whom I sought out in real life because of what their writing meant to me. And we ended up, after an interesting experience, connecting and being somewhat close until he passed away. And one should do that with care, because in real life, they're not necessarily at all like what you imagine them to be from the page.
Oh, you've heard from the show. I occasionally ask that, who did you freak out around in your field?
Exactly. Yeah. And secondly, very dutifully, I sought out the rest of his work, and I have not responded nearly as closely to some of the other things that he has written. There's just perhaps a moment in time when you're meant to intersect with a particular piece of work and a particular person.
That's why I'm glad Lampedusa died after the Leopard. They never got around to writing the second and third and fourth books that would have been, it's okay, but
right. Though I read this book called Mukiwa, A White Boy in Africa. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It was written by Peter Godwin, and he was born in what was then still Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and is one of the most beautiful works of creative nonfiction I've ever read. One of the most intelligent. One of the most restrained and yet so expressive. I had to write him, and I wrote him. And I think it's, judging from every single message I've ever gotten from somebody who's read one of my books, I think it's very meaningful for a writer to hear from a person who connected to his or her work. And I think I would like to encourage everyone listening to this to write to the people whose writing has meant something to them, because it is never irrelevant to the person receiving it, unless they're a complete asshole, in which case, as you said earlier, it's on them. It's really not on you. It's on them. And Peter not only ended up writing me back a very warm message, but we have developed a very close friendship that I think has exonerated every regret that I've had about writing someone who's turned out to be different in real life from their reputation. Which is not to say that Jim Harrison was different in a disappointing way. He was just a very different person, and I was very grateful to know him. But I think we never transcended in real life the intimacy we had as a reader and writer who never knew each other, if you know what I'm saying. So I'm not really answering your question because I'm stalling and deflecting because I can't. I'm going to write you an email as soon as I get home with more titles than you care to hear. Yeah. And if there's a way for you to weave that in, I'd like you to.
I will go downstairs to my library after this because I have to show off some way here. At which point you'll say, "Oh my God, yeah, this one."
Yeah.
I assume you do what you're going to be doing when we go downstairs, which is judge me by the books on my shelf, right?
I'm going to spend too long looking at every spine, but not to judge, just because.
Yeah, but we sort of do that. When you enter somebody's home, you just sort of.
Well, actually, the way it usually.
I'm an asshole. Just say it. It's fine.
No, it's actually the opposite. It's like, fuck, haven't read that one. Shit, haven't read that one. Is this person better read than me?
Well, that was my strategy in college. I just piled up books that people thought I had read them, and they were afraid to ask me anything. So I never actually had to get around to reading them.
And the really upsetting thing about moving is that you have to give up some books unless you have a fortune to spend on moving costs. And my library has gone whittled down, but it also forces you to think about what you're holding on to for the wrong reasons.
I've done that. I had a couple of culls of either I'm never going to read this or I'm never going to read this again.
There you go.
And even recently, I moved a whole bunch of books into the storage area under the stairs, and I always forget they're there because I spent yesterday at least 20 minutes trying to find something I knew I had, and finally hit me. Fuck, under the stairs. Duh, it's right here. But yeah, when you start making those decisions, it's the same sort of question as what books do you revisit? Because it's what books do you think you're never going to revisit? Yeah,
it's like, of course I can buy that book again, but like agreeing to surrender it is like giving up on a sort of a kind of would-be love affair that you realize is never going to take place.
I have all the William Gaddis books downstairs. Am I going to get to JR? Maybe someday.
Maybe. But who was it who was in love with JR? Was it Foster Wallace?
Probably.
It was either somebody wrote a very long Franzen.
Oh, okay.
Franzen wrote a very long
maybe
essay.
Not. I'm just kidding. And I read the Recognitions back when I finished grad school, literally the day before I got my first job out of grad school, and had the rest of Gaddis waiting for me, and I've never quite.
He's still waiting patiently.
I spoke to him once, many years ago. Before I'd actually read him, I'd only read a couple of short pieces by him. It's back in mid-'90s. I looked him up on there's a CD-ROM database of phone numbers, and I was just typing in various writers who I'd been reading up in the Paris Review, and came across Gaddis and just called him and took the call. We shot the breeze. I asked about his new novel, Frolic of His Own. Is that a good place to start with your book? With your work? He's like, it's really a frolic. I said, you won the National Book Award for it. He's like, nonetheless, it is a frolic. I was like, okay, you're the first real writer I've met, and you're denigrating your own, work. That's.
Well, I mean, and this is actually, I was about to ask you a question, and I was in a bookstore in Bellingham, Village Books, beautiful bookstore, and I opened The Overstory by Richard Powers, is it?
Yeah.
Which just won the Pulitzer Prize. And there was a breathlessness to the first page, a kind of melodramatic breathlessness that made me want to close it right away. And it's very possible that it went on to become profound and meaningful and beautiful and all those other things. But I think it's a book about
trees,
the other life of, a deeper life of trees. And on page 1, it was exactly what I feared it would be, and I closed it. And the question you have is, how did this book win the Pulitzer Prize? Who gave this book the Pulitzer Prize? It's criminal to judge a book by the first page, but we've also all read books that we've also read further in books that have been similarly laureled, where you're just like, what the fuck?
I think as a non-writer, we'll call me a non-writer for these purposes. Yeah, you see those winners, and it's just...
I don't understand.
Yeah.
And the degree to which you can ignore it is the degree to which you'll stay sane. But again, when you're even...
It's your profession. Then.
Yeah. If you're only a quarter way in, it's still quite deep. The question I was going to ask you is, and it leads to something I wanted to bring up also, is How long will you stay with a book that you're not enjoying before
Life is too short for shitty novels. Back when I used to have an office job, I talked 2 different people out of Infinite Jest. They were...
We're high-fiving each other.
100 and 400 pages. At 100 pages, one guy asked me, and does it get better? I'm like, are you hoping to find out something about the videotape? He's like, yeah. I'm like, no, you're never going to find out. Oh, I don't have to read the rest of it? I'm like, no, not if you don't want to. The other guy was a tennis guy. And so I said, are you getting anything out of the tennis stuff? He's like, not really. I've already read the Federer piece and a couple of others. I'm like,
put it down, put it away.
You're never going to find out what's on the videotape. It's unsatisfying. And it's just, ultimately an artifact of its time, maybe a symptom of his mental condition. And in a certain respect, a precursor of the bullshit aspects of the internet, where everything just, at least in that era, where everything would just kind of
expand,
into various routes and digressions, much like this conversation. But but there is, I still have the hardcover downstairs. You will see it, 900 something pages. I read that back in 1995 just to prove that I could read it. And once upon a time, I gave a shit about things like that. Now, life is too short for shitty books. I've bailed on things. Other things I've stuck with maybe it gets better, maybe not. There's a stack of books in the washroom down by the laundry of the books that for various reasons are going away, some of which were ones I began and thought, no, there's no point. Some of them were for potential guests. And when I read, I'm like, I'm just going to not send that email. I know I have a connection to this person, but I'm not enjoying their work. And that's going to come out if we talk. And I don't want to put them in a fucked up position of discussing everything but their work.
Yeah. That would be weird.
Yeah.
The reason I ask is because one thing I've discovered about myself is that, and this is horrendously out of fashion these days, but I desperately require a story.
Yeah.
Not everyone does. But I desperately require a story. If something is merely, and I put that in quotation marks, beautifully written, it's not enough. If something has a fascinating idiosyncratic character at its heart, who nonetheless does not go through something that is dramatically compelling, it's very hard for me to go through. I'm writing an essay about it for an anthology, and so perhaps it's not something I should be saying out loud, but I just reread. You asked me about books that don't hold up the second time. Well, this book didn't hold up the first time, and it certainly didn't hold up the second for the same reason. So that's a kind of consistency.
Yeah.
I hated it both times.
At least the book stayed shitty. Yeah.
And the book is Lolita.
I was going to say, that was the one for me that I read and didn't like when I was 21, 22, reread it at 30, and felt a much greater connection to it.
So I would love to hear what changed for you.
I think, and I don't know, I have it on my Kindle now, so I occasionally just dial in for a couple of pages, but I think in my early 30s, I understood much more, I'm going to say desire, but not, the explicit desire for that explicit person in Lolita. But the ways of desire and the ways we delude ourselves within it, and partly the sheer culturedness of Humbert, I found more interesting. And then the fact that there was a hidden plot underneath the whole time that he doesn't see coming, that I also found interesting structurally, that, wow, this whole thing was going on with Claire and he had no fucking idea. But, Nabokov, the jewel box guy, puts in these little clues, which again, Pale Fire does a much greater job with, right down to looking for the jewels in the index of Pale Fire and getting threaded around all over the place. But that book did hold up for me much more. Now, again, this would have been early 2000s. Who knows? And again, taking out the cultural context of the moment we're in, how the book would hold up. But it did mean more to me, with an 8 or 9 year gap from 22 to like 31.
Okay.
And at the same time, The Leopard, I got to in my early 40s. And had I read it when I was younger, I would have hated. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gotten it. I wouldn't have understood what it means to be a middle-aged man. Much less, in this case, the character is a prince and Italy is falling apart around him. But, I wouldn't have understood what it meant to be in a life in decline. And I read it at 25 or 30. 30 is when I first bought the book. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there are ones that improve over time. And there are others that, you look back, what did I get out of this? The story I tell, many, many years ago, pal of mine from the one semester I spent at Tulane, he quit the same time I did. He became a jazz pianist down there, and I met him 15 years later. Gil, man, I still have a whole stack of books you told me I should pick up back when we were in Tulane together, and I'm going to get to all those someday. And I said to him, Paul, for God's sake, just throw them out. Don't tell me what they are. Get rid of them. I will buy you, a new set. I don't want to know what I told you in 1989 was,
I'm so curious though. What did you?
Well, I actually keep a list of every book I've finished since 1989, which is on my website. I will send you the link to that one.
I do the same thing, only since 2011, but I do as well.
Is when I started college. I just started keeping track, just prose books. Comics are another world for me. But it's what's interesting is the stretch from 1997 and 1998 when I was not in a good relationship that kept going for another couple of years, where I finished a total of 7 or 8 books between those 2 years. And I look at it, I'm like, yeah, you were in a really bad mental place in that relationship, and that screwed up your ability to read. Now, thanks to this show, I read 40 to 50 books a year, so there's no time to slow down. And
God bless you.
Yeah, I've retained something from them, but I'll see.
I remember I have once experienced an episode of intense clinical depression that was situational. It's in the book. And that was when I discovered Graham Greene. Not so much discovered as, we all read The Quiet American in some obligatory way. And The Power and the Glory, I guess, but neither of those ended up being my favorite books of his. And there was just something about his writing that spoke perfectly to my state of mind. I don't know what it was.
I forget. Frederick Exley had something in a fan's notes that helped him get through. I'm blanking on what it is.
Because it's hard to motivate to do anything, reading included, and it's like he was speaking directly to something that I was experiencing. And those books have clues. It's actually probably worthwhile to revisit and try to discover what it might have been. There was just a kind of bleakness to them that was nonetheless beautifully expressed. Never showy, but very, very articulate. And they're
There's your next, well, not your next, but there's an essay for you in terms of Greene and depression. Plus, the great Golden Palomino's album, This Is How It Feels, which is based on, I think, The Power and the Glory.
Is it?
Yeah, and it is one of the greatest techno, sex, funk, rock albums of all time.
I don't know it, Al.
Oh, God, it's so good. And I recorded with the lead singer from that a couple of years ago when she had her first novel out. So,
really?
Yeah. That was
who's that?
Lori Carson, singer-songwriter, but she started out with the Palominos for 2 records that were absolutely fantastic, late 80s, early 90s. That's
duly noted.
Me connecting. Oh, and again, we'll have these email exchanges back and forth where we're sending little cultural notes at each other, I guess. But book tour, you mentioned the people reaching out and connecting that way. And in fact, in Savage Feast, you've got a connection with somebody who, had written you something nice or actually met with you at a book tour event. You're doing a bunch of publicity for this, which you said is death by 1,000 paper cuts. A, anything positive for you come out of book tour? And B, do you have book tour best practices and things you've figured out now to just,
So I want to clarify what I mean by death by 1,000 paper cuts is
not the people.
No, it's not. It's organizing. Mm-hmm. It's organizing the event. Yeah. The emails, the W-9s, the transportation, just the logistical organization. I'm not going to ask my publicist to handle every one of those things. To handle them oneself is fairly endless. That's what I mean. Once you're there, presenting.
Oh, in the moment. Yeah.
Though there are plenty of those instances when you've come quite far, and everyone sitting in front of you has a copy of your book taken out from the library.
They're trying. They don't know.
I don't know why. I don't know why it doesn't occur to people to invest in this resource. They won't think anything of spending $16 on a cocktail, but they will not spend $16 on a paperback. Paperback lasts much longer, though perhaps it's
one of my thoughts. If it's a guest whose book has already come out, if it hasn't come out yet, the publicist will send me a copy. But otherwise, I'm not going to say, "Hey, Boris, we're going to get together. Have your publicist send me a copy of Savage Feast. I'll buy the goddamn book."
Well, that's rare, though. Even that's rare. And I have to admit that I used to be a complete hypocrite about this. I bought so many books. and I couldn't afford to pay hardcover price for all of them. But little by little, in the same way that it's hard for this immigrant to shell out what something truly costs. But for the same reasons, I've been moving to like higher priced organic food, even though I'm not much better off than I used to be. I'm trying to invest in authors. Not in every single one. It's sort of like you're not gonna go to a restaurant before checking out whether it's something that's appealing to you. But more often than not, I will, because anyway,
Sorry. Yeah.
So this has taken me a very long time, but respect yourself. Ask for what you need. Remember all the things that could, so for the first couple of books, you're just grateful to be given a hotel room that you didn't have to pay for. But so often it's a terrible hotel room. I once I was a finalist for a job at a university that could go named, but no reason.
You may need something from them in the future.
I don't think I ever will.
Again, my world, it's all about hedging your bets.
Fair enough. So if you're going to be a finalist, they'll know who they are just from me saying this. If you're going to be a finalist for a job at my university, and of course you're going to have to impress me, but I also want to impress you in case you end up being the one I want. I am not going to place you in a kind of dormitory housing on campus where the toilet is literally coming out of the wall, like in a prison cell block. Right. And it's literally a cinder block structure with flickering. Yeah. Right. So,
plastic mattress and yeah.
So, it is not overly self-regarding to ask for money to do this. It is not overly self-regarding to ask to be placed in a particular kind of hotel room, or to say, hey, what is your budget? I would like to use it on an Airbnb that I'll choose myself. If anything, it is very easy to cross over into being a diva. I would never urge anything like that. But this works on the presumption that this imaginary you is not a diva, couldn't imagine being a diva. But just because you're not a diva doesn't mean you are not entitled to have a comfortable time and experience. People often forget to respect your time, and it's up to nobody else to ask for those things to be thought of and minded. Try to sleep, drink water in addition to coffee.
That's always my trade show metabolism, where all you do is bad coffee and shitty pastries all day long when you're stopping by people's booths, and then you realize it's been like 9 hours. I haven't peed, haven't done anything. And then you realize your entire system's going to collapse over the course of 3 days.
And let me just say that sort of one word that I dislike almost more than any other in our culture today is the word privilege. And there's this idea that because I've been privileged enough to be invited on book tour appearances, perhaps I should just be grateful for whatever crumb falls to me from the table. And I just want to say that I strenuously disagree with that. Like, you know what? The rich people have legitimate problems too. Just because they're rich, it does not make it impossible from having problems. Like, you know what a radical novel would be? A radical novel today would be a novel about rich people whose problems are not ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because some of them are real, and some of them deserve empathy. And just because they are rich, someone that I'm not, it does not make it illegal for them to receive consideration. There's lots of subjects that feel off limits today in a way that's very, very harmful. But this is a whole different conversation. So
I think we're going to have another one, by the way. I provided you haven't hated this entire experience. I think, talking about the directions of literature might be, especially if you decide to go into cooking, then, we could just burn some bridges.
Then I could be really free to speak my mind. My point simply being that, like, I myself have been surprised by the number of times that the people who are hosting me have been all too ready to accommodate my requests. And there's something extremely, there's a kind of self-respect that's very valuable that comes from asking for what you need. Writers are so ignored by so much of the population that you forget that you are entitled to.
And so much of your life is spent working by yourself.
By yourself.
Yeah.
You forget how to talk to other people. I do have to say, though, that like there's so many stories that I've heard about writers being complete entitled dicks that I can't stress enough that the things I'm talking about are a universe away from that kind of entitlement. Right. I would never endorse it.
We'll bring you out in the next book tour. Boris, thanks so much for coming on the show.
A real pleasure. Thank you.
And that was Boris Fishman. His new book is Savage Feast, 3 Generations, 2 Continents, and a Dinner Table, a memoir with recipes, from HarperCollins. Boris's website is borisfishman.com, which is BorisFishman.com. So Fishman. As he mentioned, he is not on Twitter, although he is on Facebook, and he's on Instagram as Boris Fishman Books, all one word. But his website has the most links to his writing and his appearances and other stuff. I will say again, I enjoyed the heck out of Savage Feast, as well as Boris's first novel, A Replacement Life. I'm hoping to get to a second novel, Don't Let My Baby Do Rodeo, but I have a stack of books from past guests that I keep saying I'm going to get to because I so enjoyed the build-up to reading their stuff and recording with them, and it is starting to get disheartening. But speaking of that, after we wrapped, I asked Boris, so, who you reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that, and get some extra conversation, because we did go a little bit over, even though he did have to get back and take care of his kid that evening, you will need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show, so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The first quarter 2019 episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Jerome Charin, Peter Cooper, Edmund White, Eva Hagberg, Mort Gerberg, James Osland, Joe Chardello, James Sturm, Martin Hageland, Bram Presser, and Nathan Englander. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. I recorded this at my home during Memorial Day weekend, so no travel, no coffee expenses, no parking, all of which was nice, because the next day I had to go into Brooklyn and then Lower Manhattan to record with Stephen Guarnacha and Hugh Ryan, both of which you've listened to already, I hope. So anyway, no real expenses, but thanks again to Dmitry Samarov for connecting me and Boris. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, parking, and coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Buzz Sawyer, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You can check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 to learn about his art, his illustration work, and his music, which you can also check out at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. That's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with the great artist and illustrator Barbara Nessim. They can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and by subscription or show by show at YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, do me a favor. Tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. Whatever you can do, help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.